The desert had gone quiet in that unnerving way it did when everything that moved had either been killed or had the sense to stay down. The air still carried the acrid tang of spent gunpowder and the metallic bite of blood. Sergeant Lyra Kane crouched low behind the half-collapsed wall of a ruined outpost, her breathing ragged through the filter of a helmet whose visor was so scratched it blurred the horizon into a smear of orange and gray. She checked her rifle again, though she already knew what she would see, the ammo counter blinking red, nearly empty. 12 rounds. That was all. 12 rounds against the mob of raiders she could hear moving through the dust, their boots crunching like a swarm of insects spreading wide, circling, savoring the trap they had laid for her. She had faced death before, but never in such a hopeless arithmetic. Her squad was gone, torn apart in the ambush. She was the last one, the last line between the raiders and the southern caravan routes they had sworn to protect. The sun beat down on her back like a cruel overseer, and the sweat under her armor felt like it would drown her if bullets did not. She wanted to close her eyes and let exhaustion take her, but something colder kept her spine locked straight. It was not duty, not entirely, it was defiance, the stubborn refusal to let the universe erase her without a fight. She shifted her grip on the rifle and pressed her cheek to the scarred stock. Through the haze of dust and the shimmer of heat rising from the sand, movement revealed itself, shadows darting between the wreckage, flashes of crude armor, the glint of blades. The raiders were getting closer. They thought she was already broken, an animal cornered for their amusement. One of them shouted something guttural in a tongue she did not recognize, and laughter followed, cruel and confident. She remembered the faces of her squad in that moment. Derek with his crooked grin, Silva always humming under her breath before a fight, Juno who swore she would see the stars again once this desert campaign was over. All gone now, ripped apart in a storm of gunfire hours earlier, their bodies left to burn in the wreckage of the convoy. Lyra swallowed the grief like acid, let it sharpen her rage until her hands stopped trembling. She had 12 bullets and she swore each would matter. She fired the first when a raider leaned too far from cover, the shot cracking his skull open before he even realized he had been sighted. The second cut down a runner trying to flank her position. She moved like she was still part of a squad, repositioning after every burst, never letting them fix her in one place. Dust stung her throat and smoke burned her eyes, but she fought on, every trigger pull echoing like a hammer striking an anvil. 10 rounds. Then 8. Then 5. Their laughter dimmed, replaced by shouts of anger. They were still too many, too bold, and her rifle was running dry. Her shoulder throbbed where a fragment of shrapnel had dug deep, her side burned where something sharp had grazed her earlier. She could taste blood on her lips. She thought of her mother then, a face she hadn't seen in years, living far across the seas in a quiet fishing town. She thought of promises she had never kept, words she had never said, and wondered if her death here would ever reach her. 4 rounds. The raiders knew she was weakening now, she could hear it in the pace of their charge. Their boots hit the sand in rhythm, their guttural cries rising as they prepared to overwhelm her. She thought about saving one bullet for herself, a merciful exit before they could drag her into their cruelty. But the thought sickened her. She had not bled and clawed her way through this cursed desert only to die on her knees. She would go out standing even if it meant emptying her rifle into the void. 2 rounds left. She leaned out, squeezed the trigger, dropped another figure in the dust. The last round chambered with a metallic snap, echoing louder than it should have in her ears. And then, for the first time in hours, she hesitated. She aimed, but the world seemed to slow, every grain of sand suspended in the air. The raiders were roaring now, closing in, their silhouettes blotting out the sinking sun. She pulled the trigger, and the rifle clicked dry. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the desert itself held its breath. Lyra lowered the rifle, chest heaving, and for a heartbeat she simply stood there, weightless, as though she were already a ghost. That was when the sound came, a deep, mechanical growl far above, slicing through the sky. She looked up, squinting against the glare. There, cutting across the orange horizon, was a shape that should not have been there, not in this forsaken stretch of land. Sleek, black, silent save for that unnatural hum, it hovered like some phantom conjured from a half-remembered nightmare. The raiders froze too, their advance faltering, heads tilted skyward in awe and confusion. The aircraft, if it could be called that, carried no insignia, no markings. It shimmered faintly as if wrapped in cloaking glass, its edges dissolving into the sunlight. And then, with a precision that defied the raging wind, a single crate detached from its belly, dropping through the air with a hiss of stabilizers. Lyra's heart pounded. The crate landed with a thud not 10 meters from her cover, its frame bristling with locks that disengaged in a rapid sequence of metallic snaps. The lid sprang open and inside gleamed the impossible, rows of fresh ammunition, stacked neatly alongside supplies she hadn't seen in weeks. Water, medkits, even grenades. The raiders shouted in alarm now, realizing what had just arrived, their voices cracking with fear and fury. Lyra stared, disbelief warring with relief, her trembling hand reaching for the cartridges like a starving woman reaching for bread. She didn't stop to wonder who had sent it or why. All she knew was that the desert had not claimed her yet, and the fight was far from over. Lyra's fingers moved with the precision of instinct, slamming the fresh magazine into her rifle and racking the bolt with a sharp metallic crack that echoed across the battlefield like thunder. The raiders, who had moments ago been howling with victory, now faltered in their charge. She saw it in their movements, in the hesitation that rippled through their formation. Fear, sudden and raw. Whoever had sent that crate had shifted the balance, and now the hunters were unsure whether they remained hunters at all. Lyra rose from her crouch, bloodied and staggering but unbroken, the weight of exhaustion burned away by the fierce clarity of survival. She leveled her weapon and fired, each round finding a target, each burst driving them back. Dust plumed around their collapsing line as her shots cut through the chaos. They scattered for cover, their jeers replaced by curses, their confidence shattered in seconds. She advanced without thinking, her boots crunching on broken stone, her armor streaked with grime and blood, her eyes locked on the wavering silhouettes of her enemies. The crate behind her still gaped open like a promise, and she would not let it be wasted. She reloaded again and again, her rifle steady as if the weapon itself had fused to her bones. Bodies dropped in the sand, and the stench of charred metal and sweat thickened the air. Yet even as she pressed forward, questions clawed at the back of her mind. What phantom ship had come to her aid and why? There were no Allied patrols in this sector, no reinforcements within 100 miles, only enemies in the empty desert. Whoever had watched her through the storm had chosen her for reasons she could not fathom. But in the moment, the mystery mattered less than the survival it bought her. She fired until the dust itself seemed to bleed red, until her voice was raw from shouting, until her muscles screamed against the weight of her rifle. And then at last the silence returned, not the suffocating silence of despair she had known before the crate arrived, but the hollow quiet of aftermath, broken only by the groans of the wounded raiders dragging themselves away into the sand. She stood over them like an executioner, her shadow long in the setting sun. For a heartbeat she considered finishing them all, ending their threat forever. But her hands would not move, not with the weariness crashing down on her now that the fire of combat was dimming. She lowered her rifle, her chest heaving, and simply watched them vanish into the horizon, their courage broken and their bodies scarred by her defiance. Her knees buckled then, the adrenaline gone, leaving only the raw weight of pain and loss. She collapsed against the crate, pressing her head against its cold steel, and let out a laugh that broke into sobs. Relief, grief, disbelief, all tangled in one unbearable knot inside her chest. The desert wind whipped around her, carrying with it the scent of smoke and salt from her sweat. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think. Her squad was gone and she was alone. Whoever had sent the phantom aircraft had saved her once, but there was no guarantee they would return. If she stayed here, the raiders would regroup, and this miracle would turn to ash. She had to move. She gathered supplies from the crate with trembling hands, ammunition stacked into pouches, grenades clipped to her belt, medkits stuffed into her pack. She found water, precious and clean, and drank until her cracked throat no longer burned. Strength seeped back into her limbs, though her wounds still ached. She patched them clumsily, biting down hard against the sting of antiseptic, and pushed herself to her feet again. The aircraft was gone now, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. She scanned the sky until her eyes blurred, but there was nothing, only the vast, merciless expanse stretching to the horizon. Still, she felt watched, as if unseen eyes tracked her every move from some vantage she could not reach. She hefted her rifle, steadied herself, and began walking. The desert was a graveyard now, littered with twisted metal and silent corpses. Each step carried her past memories she could not escape, the scorched remains of Derek's helmet, Silva's scarf tangled in the rubble, Juno's sidearm half buried in the sand. She forced herself not to stop, not to look too long, because if she did the grief would chain her in place forever. She whispered their names instead, each one a vow that their deaths would not be meaningless. As the sun bled into the horizon, the sky turning purple and gold, she reached the edge of the battlefield and looked back one final time. The crate gleamed faintly in the fading light, like a beacon, like a question carved into the earth. She turned away before it could break her resolve and pressed on into the desert night. Hours passed. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant, watching her stumble through the dunes. The sand shifted treacherously under her boots, and her wounds dragged at her, threatening to pull her down. But the thought of collapsing in this wasteland, of leaving her bones to be buried beneath endless drifts, drove her forward. Somewhere out there, beyond this dead land, was a friendly outpost, a line of defense still holding. If she could reach it, the sacrifice of her squad might still matter. She would not let their deaths fade into silence. But with every mile, her mind returned to the phantom aircraft. The way it had appeared, unmarked, silent, carrying salvation in its belly as if it had known exactly when and where she would fall. No ordinary patrol could have tracked her so precisely. No ally had the resources to send such a craft here, not without drawing the attention of the raiders long before. It was something else, something larger, and its presence gnawed at her like a secret too vast to ignore. Was she part of something greater now, some unseen design? Or had she simply been spared by chance, a lone survivor plucked from the jaws of death for reasons beyond comprehension? She clenched her fists around her rifle and pressed onward, the desert wind whispering through the night. Whatever the truth was, she intended to find it. The desert night was merciless, colder than steel and vast enough to swallow every thought that lingered too long. Lyra trudged across the shifting dunes with her rifle slung tight across her shoulder, every step a battle against exhaustion and pain. The stars above glittered like fragments of shattered glass, too distant to care for the struggles of a lone soldier staggering beneath them. Her breath formed white clouds against the visor of her helmet, and frost began to crust around the cracked seals of her armor. The water she had taken from the crate was running low, and though the medkits had dulled the sting of her wounds, her muscles still trembled with every motion. She pushed on, not because she believed she could endure forever, but because to stop would be to invite death to lay its hand on her shoulder. The thought of her squad, of their faces now ash and dust in the desert, remained the flame inside her chest. They had trusted her to lead them here, and even though she had failed to bring them back alive, she would not dishonor their memory by letting herself collapse into nothingness. Every step was an act of rebellion against the futility that threatened to devour her. Hours bled into one another until time lost its edges, until she could not tell whether she had been walking for minutes or days. Her vision blurred, her mind drifting into the dangerous fog of half-consciousness, where the line between hallucination and reality was razor-thin. It was in that haze that she saw the first glimmer of movement on the horizon. At first she thought it a trick of the stars, some mirage conjured by fatigue. But then the glimmer grew sharp and deliberate, like a beacon pulsing against the darkness. Her heart quickened, adrenaline slicing through her weariness. She dropped low, pressing herself against the sand, her eyes locked on the strange light. It flickered not like fire, not like a signal flare, but like something colder, mechanical. A pale glow sweeping rhythmically as though scanning the land. The phantom aircraft. It had returned. She felt it before she truly saw it, the low hum crawling through the air, vibrating in her bones. She raised her head and squinted against the night. There it was again, its silhouette almost invisible, its edges shimmering as if wrapped in the air itself. It moved soundlessly above the dunes, a predator in the sky, searching. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Was it here for her again, guiding her, or had it come to finish what it had started with that single crate? She tightened her grip on her rifle, though she knew a single soldier's weapon was nothing against something that could traverse the sky like a ghost. She waited, tense, watching as the craft drifted overhead, its strange pale glow sweeping across the sand. Then it paused, hovering. The glow centered on her position. Lyra's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She rose slowly, rifle hanging low but ready, her stance unflinching. If it was here to kill her, then she would die standing just as she had promised herself before. But the craft did not fire. Instead, the hum deepened, and another crate detached from its underbelly, descending in a controlled spiral until it struck the ground with a muffled thud not 10 paces away. The locks hissed, the lid sprang open, and inside she saw not just supplies but technology she had never laid eyes on before, sleek cartridges glowing faintly blue, medical injectors that pulsed with light, a compact device humming with energy like a heart. Her breath caught. This was no standard military issue, no equipment she had ever seen in her years of service. Whoever had sent this craft was not merely supplying her, they were arming her with tools beyond her comprehension. She stepped closer, her boots crunching in the frost-coated sand, and reached out with hesitant fingers. The cartridges were warm to the touch, humming faintly as if alive. She slid one into her rifle, and the weapon purred with sudden energy, its display flashing symbols she did not recognize. She swung it experimentally, feeling a strange weightlessness in the barrel, as though the weapon had been remade in her hands. The air seemed sharper around her, charged. A sound tore her from her awe, the howl of engines, distant but growing. She spun toward the horizon, her visor catching the faint glimmer of headlights cresting a dune. A raider convoy, half a dozen vehicles bristling with mounted guns, roaring toward her position. Somehow they had tracked her, and now they were closing in with a vengeance, the desert trembling beneath their wheels. Lyra's stomach twisted, but when she turned back toward the phantom aircraft for aid, it was gone, vanished as silently as it had come, leaving her with its strange gift. She stared at the convoy bearing down on her, at the guns flashing in the night, and then at the glowing cartridges locked into her rifle. Whatever this technology was, she would not waste it. She braced herself against the crate, took aim and squeezed the trigger. The rifle responded with a roar not of gunpowder but of energy, a searing bolt of light lancing across the desert and tearing the lead vehicle into molten shards. The explosion lit the dunes like daylight, and the raiders' howls of triumph twisted into screams of panic. Lyra's eyes widened, disbelief flooding her veins. She had never seen a weapon do that, not in all her years of combat. The convoy wavered, vehicles swerving in terror, but the others pressed forward, firing wildly into the night. Bullets stitched the sand around her, sparks skittering from her armor. She returned fire, each glowing round obliterating metal and flesh alike, carving craters into the earth. The weapon had no recoil, no hesitation, as if it were an extension of her will. She became a storm, her voice a wordless cry as she cut down vehicle after vehicle, until the desert was a graveyard of burning wrecks. At last, silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of flames. Lyra staggered, the rifle still glowing faintly in her grip, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion but from the enormity of what she had just unleashed. She looked at the weapon, then at the crate, then back at the star-filled sky. Whoever they were, whoever controlled that phantom craft, they had just turned her into something more than a soldier. They had given her power she could barely comprehend. She dropped to her knees in the sand, surrounded by wreckage, the night alive with smoke and fire. And for the first time she felt not just the weight of survival, but the heavy, undeniable pull of destiny. Lyra remained kneeling in the sand, the glow of burning wreckage casting jagged shadows across her visor. Her chest rose and fell like a drumbeat, and her hands would not steady no matter how tightly she gripped the strange rifle. Around her lay the remains of men and machines, raiders who only hours ago had been predators certain of their kill. Now they were reduced to fire and silence, and she stood above them not as prey but as something they had never expected. She lifted her gaze to the sky again, half expecting the phantom craft to reveal itself, to hover overhead and offer her more gifts, or perhaps demand repayment. But there was only darkness and the distant shimmer of stars. The silence pressed heavily against her, filled with too many questions and no answers. She rose, staggering slightly, and turned her focus back to the crate. The energy cartridges glowed faintly, dozens of them stacked neatly, alongside the strange medical injectors and compact device that hummed like a living heart. She examined the device more closely, her fingers brushing over its surface. It was smooth, seamless, unlike anything she had seen, and as her touch lingered, the hum deepened, responding as though it sensed her. A ripple of light pulsed across its surface, and for a heartbeat she thought she heard something. Not a voice, not quite, but a vibration that resonated deep in her skull, like a word she almost recognized but could not fully grasp. She jerked her hand away, her breath quickening. The device went silent again, its hum settling back to a steady rhythm, waiting. She did not know whether to be grateful or terrified. She gathered what she could carry, strapping the cartridges and injectors into her pack, and reluctantly left the device behind. It was too large, too heavy, and too unknown to risk burdening herself with it in the middle of the desert. Yet as she turned away, she felt its absence like a weight pressing against her spine. She marched on into the night, her path lit by the glow of fires slowly dying behind her. The stars above watched her like indifferent gods, their cold brilliance offering no comfort. She pressed forward, driven now not only by survival but by the gnawing hunger for answers. Someone had chosen her, supplied her, armed her with impossible technology. That choice carried meaning whether she wanted it or not, and she needed to know what it was. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the dunes in pale light, and with it came the bitter bite of exhaustion. Her legs dragged through the sand, her armor heavy, her wounds aching despite the medkits. She stumbled more than once, catching herself just before collapsing. But each time she thought she might give in, her eyes would fall on the glowing cartridges strapped across her chest, and strength would return like fire in her veins. Whoever her benefactor was, they had not saved her only to let her die so soon. As the sun climbed higher, heat once again pressed down on her like a hammer. Sweat pooled under her armor, her throat dry despite careful rationing of water. She pressed on, her eyes scanning the horizon endlessly for signs of shelter, for any structure that might offer respite. At last she saw it, the faint outline of a watchtower rising from the sand, distant but unmistakable. Her heart leapt, her pace quickened despite the protest of her limbs. An outpost. She might not be alone in this wasteland after all. She forced herself onward, step by grueling step, until the tower grew larger, revealing low walls and the crumbling remains of fortifications. Relief surged in her chest, but it was short-lived. As she drew nearer, she realized the outpost was not manned by her allies. The banners that hung from its walls were torn but still bore the crude symbols of the raider clans. Smoke drifted from inside, and the sound of harsh laughter carried. Her boots hitting the dirt with finality. "When do we move?" she asked, her voice steady, and the commander gave a slight shake of his head, half in disbelief at her relentless drive. "At first light. Get some rest, Lieutenant. You've earned it." Rest. The word felt foreign, almost impossible, but she obeyed, making her way to the tent pitched for her, though she knew sleep would not come easy. When she closed her eyes, the night replayed itself in vivid flashes. The scream of engines, the glow of tracers, the mountain collapsing under fire, and beneath it all, the unshakable certainty that tomorrow she would do it again. For this was not duty imposed upon her by birth, nor honor given as inheritance. This was her choice, her war, her path carved with every scream of the Warthog's cannon, and nothing, not her father's doubts, not the SEAL's dismissal, not the shadow of death itself, would turn her from it. Dawn crept over the desert like a blade cutting the horizon, washing the jagged ridges in pale fire, and the base stirred awake with the quiet rhythm of soldiers who had long ago learned to meet exhaustion with discipline. Engines coughed to life, weapons were checked and rechecked, and the air carried the metallic scent of oil mingling with the bitter tang of instant coffee. Avery rose before the others, strapping on her flight suit with practiced precision, her movements sharp though her body ached from the strain of yesterday's battle. She glanced once toward the ridge now scarred and blackened in the distance, then turned away, her focus narrowing to the mission ahead. Intel briefings confirmed that the insurgents were regrouping several kilometers east, reinforcing a valley that ran between two cliffs, a natural choke point that could turn into a slaughterhouse if handled poorly. The commander gathered the SEALs around a rough map laid out on a metal table, his finger tracing the contours of the valley as he outlined their approach. "They'll expect us to come from the north," he said, voice steady, "so we're pushing through the west slope, breaching here. If they've brought in heavier weaponry, we'll be walking into a kill zone. That's where Stanton comes in." At the sound of her name, every head turned, not with skepticism as before but with something closer to reliance, the unspoken admission that their survival now hinged on her steel wings. Avery met their eyes without flinching, her voice calm. "I'll clear the valley ahead of your advance. You'll have a corridor but timing will be tight. Once I've run my first pass you move. If you hesitate you'll be caught in the fire." No one argued. They had seen the Warthog speak, had felt it scream in their bones, and they knew better now than to doubt her. Hours later, the desert heat pressed down like a physical weight as the convoy rolled toward the valley, dust trailing behind the armored vehicles, every man alert, every weapon ready. Above them, the A-10 roared into position, its shadow sweeping over the sand like a warning. Avery's hands gripped the controls, eyes locked on the HUD as she scanned the valley floor. Movement flickered on thermal imaging, clusters of fighters, sand-colored trucks mounted with heavy guns, even the faint glint of what could only be surface-to-air missiles positioned on the ridge. Her chest tightened, but she did not hesitate. She keyed the comms. Contact confirmed. Multiple emplacements, including Sam's. Commencing strike. And then the scream came again, the unholy roar of the G-8 Avenger as the Warthog dove into the valley, cannon rounds ripping earth and steel apart in a torrent of fire. Trucks erupted into flames, fighters scattered like insects, and the first missile platform was shredded before it could even lock on. The SEALs moved in synchronicity, charging the slope under her cover, rifles spitting precise bursts, advancing through chaos as if it were a drill. But the insurgents were not the same fractured force as before. They had learned, adapted, and as Avery pulled up from her first pass, warning alarms blared in her cockpit, the telltale lock of a missile tracking her heat signature. She banked hard, flares spewing behind her, the missile streaking through the sky like a vengeful spear. It exploded harmlessly in her wake, but the shockwave rattled her teeth, and for a split second she tasted mortality sharp on her tongue. She steadied, her focus sharpening to a diamond's edge. "Sam's still active," she reported. "I'm going back in." "Negative," the commander snapped through comms, but Avery was already diving, engines screaming, the world narrowing to the glowing target ahead. She unleashed another burst, the cannon carving the ridge into shrapnel, detonating the missile platform in a ball of fire that painted the valley in crimson light. Below, the SEALs seized their opening, breaching the western slope, clearing bunkers room by room, their advance fueled by the knowledge that the sky itself was on their side. 4 hours the battle raged, a brutal dance of steel and flesh, and Avery became the rhythm that carried it, circling, striking, shielding her team from above with every pass. By the time the valley fell silent, the sun had burned high overhead, and the desert floor was littered with the wreckage of both machines and men. The SEALs emerged battered but alive, their boots crunching over broken weapons and spent shells, their breaths heavy but victorious. From above, the Warthog dipped low, its engines growling in acknowledgement, and though no words passed between them, every man knew that without her, the valley would have been their grave. When she landed hours later at the makeshift strip, the men were waiting, their faces drawn but their eyes alight with something rare, admiration, even awe. The commander stepped forward, his hand firm on her shoulder. "You're not just part of this team anymore," he said quietly. "You're the edge that keeps us alive." And in that moment, Avery Stanton, once dismissed as nothing more than an heiress, felt the truth settle into her bones. She had carved her place not with words, not with lineage, but with fire and steel, and the scream of her A-10 would forever be the song of their survival. Night came to the valley with an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint crackle of distant fires still smoldering among the wreckage, and the SEALs set a perimeter, their silhouettes sharp against the dying light as they secured what ground they had bled to claim. Avery sat in the cockpit of her A-10 even after the engines cooled, unwilling to step away, her eyes tracing the ridges where the insurgents had once hidden, her ears still ringing with the phantom echo of cannon fire. She knew the mission wasn't over, victories in this desert never were. Each strike, each cleared position only cut one head from a hydra that grew two more in its place, and already intelligence whispered of supply caravans winding toward the valley under cover of darkness, bringing reinforcements and weapons more dangerous than before. The commander approached her aircraft quietly, his expression grim beneath the dim glow of the portable lamps, and when she finally climbed down to meet him, his words were as heavy as the heat that lingered in the sand. "We have less than 6 hours before they regroup. Satellite scans show movement from the east, armored vehicles, possibly even stolen anti-aircraft platforms. If they reach us before extraction, this valley turns into a coffin." Avery's jaw tightened. She could already picture it. Convoys crawling like insects across the desert floor, missiles mounted on trucks, men with eyes full of vengeance and nothing left to lose. The SEALs were strong, but even their skill had limits, and without cover from above, they would be crushed beneath the tide. "Then I'll hold them back," she said simply, the words leaving no room for doubt. The commander hesitated, as if weighing whether to remind her of the risk, but then he nodded, knowing arguments were wasted on someone who had already proven that fear could not bend her. The team prepared through the night, laying mines along the valley entrance, fortifying positions with scavenged steel, rationing ammunition with the precision of men who had counted bullets against hours of survival. Avery rested only in fragments, her head bowed against her knees beside the wing of her Warthog, eyes snapping open at every sound, every whisper of wind that might have been footsteps. When the first pale blush of dawn touched the sky, the desert erupted with the thunder of engines, convoys approaching, their silhouettes blotting the horizon. Dust plumes rose like smoke signals, carrying the promise of violence. Avery climbed into her cockpit, strapping in with movements so practiced they felt like ritual, and as the turbines roared to life, the SEALs lifted their eyes toward her with something like reverence. The commander's voice crackled through her headset. "They're coming fast. Do what you do best, Lieutenant. Give us the sky." And so she did. The A-10 screamed into the rising sun, wings cutting through the dawn, and the enemy convoys below erupted into chaos as her shadow swept across them. The Ju-8 Avenger spat its wrath once more, a torrent of shells ripping the desert apart, turning armored trucks into twisted pyres. Explosions rolled like thunder across the valley, each one a heartbeat of destruction, each one carving moments of survival for the men below. But the insurgents were ready this time. From the rear of the convoy, missile launchers rose, their warheads glinting cruelly in the morning light. Warning alarms blared in Avery's cockpit as two, then three missiles streaked skyward, their trails twisting like burning serpents. She banked hard, flares erupting behind her, the sky splitting with explosions as decoys ignited, but one missile refused to be fooled. It closed the distance, a predator locked on prey, and with a snap decision Avery rolled into a dive so steep her body crushed against the seat, vision tunneling as gravity tried to tear her apart. The missile screamed past her wingtip and detonated against the ridge, the shockwave rattling her bones but sparing her aircraft. Gritting her teeth, she leveled out, sweat pouring down her spine and swung back into the fight. Below, the SEALs cheered as her cannon tore another swath through the convoy, but Avery heard none of it, her mind locked in the razor focus of survival. Again and again she dove, strafing enemy lines, crippling their advance, until the valley floor was a patchwork of flames and wreckage. The insurgents fought on with desperate fury, RPGs arcing into the sky, bullets pinging harmlessly against her armored frame, but they could not match the storm raining down upon them. Hours stretched like years and still Avery flew, until at last the horizon cleared, the last of the convoy reduced to smoking ruin, the survivors scattering into the desert with nothing left but fear. When silence returned, it was deafening. Avery circled once, twice, ensuring no threat remained, then finally guided her battered warthog back toward the strip. Her hands shook as she lowered the throttle, the adrenaline finally ebbing, but she kept her movement steady until the wheels touched down. The SEALs were waiting again, lined up in the heat, their faces smeared with dust and exhaustion, their eyes fixed on her with something more than respect now. It was awe, tempered with gratitude too deep for words. The commander stepped forward, his voice rough with fatigue and truth. "We shouldn't be standing here, Lieutenant. But we are. Because of you." Avery met his gaze, her body heavy with exhaustion, her heart still burning with fire. She wanted to tell him she was only doing her duty, that the sky was her battleground and the warthog her weapon, but the words felt unnecessary. They already knew. She had shown them not once but twice, that she was not the heiress they had dismissed. She was the storm that broke their enemies, the scream across the ridge that turned despair into survival, and as the sun rose higher over the valley, every man there understood that wherever the war took them next, they would follow her shadow without question. The desert stretched endless in every direction, a sea of heat and silence that seemed to swallow even the memory of battle, and yet the valley still smoked behind them, blackened scars carved into the sand as proof of the fire that had fallen from the sky. The SEALs moved with deliberate precision as they prepared for extraction, their gear packed, their weapons cleaned and reloaded, their eyes always scanning the horizon as if expecting another tide of enemies to rise from the dust. Avery stood apart, leaning against the wing of her A-10, the heat radiating from the metal seeping into her bones, her body heavier than she wanted to admit. Every muscle ached from the strain of combat flights, every nerve still hummed with the aftershock of near misses and narrow survival, but she forced herself upright, refusing to let the exhaustion show. The commander approached her, his face drawn with fatigue but sharpened with determination, and when he spoke his voice carried both urgency and weight. "Command wants us to hold here until the next phase. Intel suggests there's a weapons cache hidden deep in the eastern canyons. If the insurgents get to it before we do, we'll be facing more than convoys and RPGs next time. They'll have anti-air systems advanced enough to ground even you." Avery's stomach knotted, not with fear but with a cold recognition of what that meant. The A-10 was built for punishment, armored like a beast, but even it had limits, and modern missile systems could turn her sky into a cage of fire. She looked toward the horizon, where the canyons rose like jagged teeth, shadows hiding secrets older than the war, and she nodded once. "Then we get there first." The SEALs moved out before dawn, cutting across the desert with silent efficiency, their convoy weaving between dunes and ridges as the A-10 circled above, Avery's eyes scanning the endless expanse through her HUD. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by radio check-ins and the low rumble of engines, until the canyons loomed ahead, massive stone walls rising from the sand like the bones of giants. The valley narrowed as they entered, cliffs pressing in close, and every man felt the weight of being funneled into a place that could easily become their grave. Avery flew low, her engines echoing against the canyon walls, the roar bouncing back in ghostly waves, her eyes flicking from shadow to shadow as if the stone itself might spring to life. Then she saw it. A flicker on thermal imaging, the faint heat signature of machinery buried beneath tarps and sand. "Contact," she reported sharply. "Eastern wall, 300 meters ahead. Multiple crates. Possible launch platforms." The convoy halted, men fanning out with weapons raised, and the commander gave the order to breach. Explosions rattled the canyon as charges tore open the hidden bunkers, and the truth spilled out like poison. Crates filled with missiles, boxes of ammunition, racks of rifles fresh from foreign manufacturers, and in the deepest chamber, the unmistakable shape of advanced anti-air systems, sleek and deadly. The SEALs worked quickly, planting charges to destroy the cache, but the enemy was already moving. Gunfire cracked from the cliffs above, echoing in bursts that turned the canyon into a kill box. Fighters poured from hidden caves, their ambush sprung with ruthless precision, and the SEALs returned fire, their shouts drowned in the chaos. Avery banked hard, diving into the canyon with her Warthog's engines howling, and unleashed the Avenger in a torrent of destruction. Rock and sand exploded as her rounds tore into enemy positions, collapsing ledges, scattering fighters, shredding machine guns before they could cut down her team. But the canyon was treacherous, its walls too tight for easy maneuvers, and as she pulled up from a strafing run, alarms blared in her cockpit, locks from portable SAMs hidden in the cliffs. Flares streaked behind her as missiles chased her wake, one detonating so close that shrapnel hammered her fuselage, rattling the cockpit with brutal force. Pain lanced through her as her head slammed against the seat, but she steadied, forcing the Warthog into a climb that scraped her wings within feet of the stone walls. The SEALs fought below, advancing under her cover, clearing cave after cave in a storm of gunfire and grenades. The canyon became a furnace, filled with smoke, dust, and screams, and Avery circled back again and again, strafing, suppressing, shielding. Hours bled away in the inferno until at last the final charges detonated, the weapons cache consumed in a chain of explosions so massive it shook the very bones of the canyon. Fire rolled upward in a pillar of smoke, heat blasting even through the Warthog's armored skin, and the earth trembled with the violence of its destruction. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and the ragged breaths of men who had given everything to survive. The SEALs emerged from the smoke, battered, bleeding but alive, their mission complete. Avery circled once more before guiding the A-10 back toward open desert, her hands trembling as adrenaline ebbed, her mind still locked in the razor edge of battle. When she landed at the makeshift strip hours later, the commander was waiting, his uniform scorched, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, but his voice steady with truth. That cache would have killed hundreds, maybe thousands. You stopped it. We stopped it. But without you, Lieutenant, none of us would have walked out of that canyon. Avery met his gaze, her body shaking with the weight of fatigue and pain, and she realized that whatever doubts had once lingered among them were gone. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the heiress wearing borrowed steel. She was their pilot, their shield, their storm, and in the silence that followed, the men who had once dismissed her now looked at her with something deeper than respect. They looked at her with trust. The desert night was colder than stone, a biting wind slipping through the canyons as if eager to erase the fires that had raged there only hours before, and the SEALs huddled around dim lanterns at the temporary base, their faces gaunt, their movements slow, every man carrying wounds both visible and buried. Avery sat slightly apart, her back pressed to the wheel of her A-10, helmet resting on her knees, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of engines humming in her ears. Her body ached in ways she could not ignore, her shoulders stiff, her hands raw from gripping the controls, her skull still throbbing from where shrapnel's shockwave had slammed her against her seat, but she knew rest was only an illusion, a brief pause in a war that never slept. She closed her eyes and heard the screams of the Avenger cannon, felt the shudder of missiles missing her by inches, saw the canyon walls collapsing in fire and dust. Her chest tightened with the memory of how close it had come, how easily one strike could have ended everything, not just for her but for the men who had finally begun to trust her. A voice broke through her thoughts, quiet but steady, the commander lowering himself onto a crate across from her. His eyes were sharp despite the fatigue, and in the dim light they carried something she had not seen before, concern. You're pushing yourself past the edge, Lieutenant. You've flown sorties without pause, fought harder than anyone here, and I can see it wearing you down. No one would fault you if you took a step back. Avery looked at him, her jaw set, her voice firm even through exhaustion. If I stop, they die. If I hesitate even for a second, those convoys roll through, those caches arm their fighters, and the next time we won't walk away. I can't stop, Commander. Not while I can still fly. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod, understanding that this fire inside her was not something that could be extinguished with words. Then we'll make sure you keep flying. But know this, respect isn't the same as immortality. The men trust you now, but they'd rather have you alive than a legend burned into the sand. She didn't answer, but his words lingered long after he left, echoing against the cold desert night. When dawn came, so did new orders. Command had intercepted chatter about a high-value insurgent leader moving toward the northern mountains, escorted by convoys and fighters, a man responsible for coordinating strikes across the entire region. Taking him out could shift the balance of the war, but the mission was suicidal. Deep territory, fortified ridges, and skies bristling with stolen anti-aircraft tech. The SEALs were tasked with the ground assault, and Avery was their shield, their spear, their lifeline. As the convoy moved out, her warthog rose into the sky once more, engines tearing through morning silence, and the men below felt steadier simply knowing she was overhead. The northern mountains loomed like black teeth, jagged and cruel, shadows swallowing the valleys between them. From the air, Avery saw movement long before the SEALs reached it, armored trucks lined across ridgelines, gun nests dug into cliffs, and at the center of it all, a heavily fortified compound bristling with weapons. She keyed her comms, her voice clipped and precise. Target confirmed. Multiple emplacements, heavy resistance. You'll be walking into hell. The commander's reply came without hesitation. Then give us the storm, Lieutenant. Clear us a path. And the storm came. The A-10 screamed down the valley, cannon fire shredding vehicles, missiles slamming into bunkers, the ground erupting in geysers of fire and stone. The insurgents scrambled, firing everything they had skyward, tracers, rockets, portable SAMs, but Avery danced through it, her aircraft rolling, diving, flaring with deadly precision. She struck again and again, carving holes in their defenses, until the SEALs surged into the compound, breaching walls under her cover, their rifles barking thunder as they cut a path toward their target. But the enemy was prepared, more than she had ever seen. Alarms shrieked in her cockpit as locks multiplied, not one, not two, but a swarm of missiles launching from hidden emplacements, filling the sky with death. She banked hard, flares pouring behind her like falling stars, but explosions shook the air. Around her, fragments slamming into her fuselage, alarms screaming as systems flickered. Pain lanced through her chest as the aircraft shuddered, but she forced it level, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of fire and focus. Below, the SEALs fought through chaos, pinned down by waves of fighters, their survival dependent on whether she could hold the sky. Stay with us, Stanton. The commander's voice roared over comms, and she gritted her teeth, answering with action. She dove into the swarm of fire, the Avenger screaming one last furious song, tearing through missile launchers, ripping apart convoys, collapsing towers of stone that buried enemy fighters beneath avalanches. Every second she bought was another step forward for her team, another chance for them to reach their target. The compound burned, the mountains shook, and through it all the A-10 roared, battered but unbroken, a beast defying death itself. When the high-value target finally fell, dragged from the wreckage of his bunker by SEALs who had clawed victory from hell, Avery's warthog circled above like a guardian angel scarred by battle. Systems failing, armor shredded, fuel bleeding, she still held her bird in the sky until the commander's voice broke through with finality. Objective secure. Pull back, Lieutenant. You've done enough. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe, guiding the crippled aircraft back toward base, her hands steady even as exhaustion weighed on her like lead. Below, the men who had once dismissed her now looked up with eyes that carried something beyond respect, beyond trust. They looked at her as if she were the very sky itself, merciless, unyielding, eternal. The battered A-10 touched down with a groan of metal and smoke trailing from its scarred frame, the wheels kissing the makeshift strip with a violence that mirrored the storm it had survived. Avery held the controls steady even as alarms shrieked in protest, her body trembling with exhaustion, her vision blurring at the edges, but she refused to falter until the aircraft came to a full stop. Only then did she let her head sag forward, sweat dripping from her brow, her breath coming in ragged gulps as if her lungs were reluctant to accept the quiet after so much fire. The canopy cracked open with a hiss, and the heat of the desert rushed in, dry and merciless, carrying with it the scent of dust and scorched steel. She climbed down slowly, each movement deliberate, her boots hitting the dirt with finality, and for a moment she stood still, staring at the war machine that had been both her shield and her weapon. The warthog looked wounded, its skin torn by shrapnel, its paint scorched, yet its presence was still fearsome, a beast that had refused to die even when death circled close. The SEALs approached as a unit, their faces grim and lined with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with a light Avery had never seen before, something deeper than respect, something carved in the marrow of survival. The commander stepped forward, his uniform torn, his face streaked with dirt, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of truth forged in fire. We wouldn't be here if not for you. That target would still be breathing, his war still feeding. But because of you, Lieutenant, it ends here. You did what no one else could." The men behind him said nothing, but their silence was louder than any words, their eyes locked on her with an acknowledgement that could not be faked or forced. They had doubted her, dismissed her, mocked her as a name without weight, but now they knew her as the storm that had carried them through fire, the scream that had broken their enemies, the steel that had shielded their lives. Avery met their gaze, her body shaking, her heart heavy with the cost of what they had done. She thought of the ridge, the valley, the canyon, the mountain compound, all the places where fire had fallen, where lives had ended, where victory had been bought with blood. She thought of her father's voice telling her she did not belong, of the whispers that her rank was purchased, of the doubt that had followed her like a shadow. And then she thought of the warthog's scream, the roar that had silenced every doubt, the fire that had carved her place in steel and sky. The commander extended his hand, rough and firm, and this time when she took it there was no hesitation, no barrier, only the bond of warriors who had faced death together and emerged scarred but unbroken. "You're one of us now," he said simply, and the words settled into her like a final truth, sealing every doubt, silencing every ghost. The days that followed blurred into a haze of movement and silence. Reports filed, orders given, new missions whispered like storms on the horizon. Yet everywhere she walked in the camp, eyes followed her with a different weight now, not with dismissal or skepticism, but with the certainty that when the sky darkened, she would be there, and with her, survival. She spent her hours repairing the A-10, hands dirty with grease and blood, her body moving with reverence as if tending to a wounded comrade rather than a machine. Every dent, every scar told a story, each one a reminder of how close death had come and how fiercely they had defied it. When the engines roared again, smoother now but still scarred, the sound echoed across the desert like a promise, that she was not done, that the war had not broken her, that the sky still belonged to her scream. One night, when the camp lay quiet and the stars stretched endless above, Avery stood alone by the warthog, the desert wind tugging at her hair, her eyes fixed on the horizon where darkness bled into light. She thought of everything she had endured, of every doubt, every dismissal, every near-death breath that had tried to crush her. And she thought of what came next, the battles still to be fought, the enemy still to be faced, the storms still to be unleashed. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, not to the men, not to the desert, but to herself, a vow carved into the night. "I'm not just an heiress. I'm not just a name. I am the storm. I am the scream across the ridge. And I will never stop." The words vanished into the wind, carried into the endless night, but she knew they would remain, etched in her bones, burned into her blood. And when dawn came again, with new orders, new battles, new fires waiting to be unleashed, Avery Stanton would climb into her cockpit, wrap her hands around the controls, and rise once more into the sky, where doubt could never follow, where only the roar of the warthog and the scream of fire would speak her truth. The end.